Hello, Lee. Nice to see you. How are you?
Hi, Namali. I'm fine. How are you?
I'm doing well. Today, we are starting a series of calls that we'll do on each of the stages of the spiral dynamics model, which is such a brilliant model. You know, some people, I think some academics don't like it. There are lots of people who will have problems with it. In fact, I was just watching a video on Rebel Wisdom where one of their guests said it's a crude model. We don't have anything that expresses what spiral dynamics expresses too much better than it does. So I say we stick with spiral dynamics because it has served an amazing purpose for some of our work in the integral world of coaching and facilitation and just understanding ourselves and understanding others and the world a whole lot better than I think we would had we not been introduced to this beautiful model. So, how do you feel about what I just shared about spiral dynamics? What do you think?
Well, I think it's a great way to provide some context because it is a model that tries to generalize about historical and also individual development. And if we look at history, we can find numerous examples of exceptions to these generalizations, and the same goes for individuals. So it's very difficult for everyone to agree on the value and validity of such an all-encompassing model. But I totally agree with you that if we hold it very lightly and we see that it's just an approximation of reality and not reality itself, then I think it is skillful means to use it when it's appropriate to promote insight and but also, as we've been speaking about on many of our calls, also compassion, because then you can see that each developmental stage, both historically and in individuals, has its place, and that everything is where it is, and that we don't need to judge harshly developmental phases.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so let's maybe give just a little bit of context to what spiral dynamics is, how it came into being. First, I will say spiral dynamics, as we know it today, is a very complex system. And what we're doing here today between you and I, Lee, is that we're trying to give it a sort of an introduction to maybe perhaps people who aren't familiar with it, or people who haven't had the time or don't have the time or the desire even to kind of get into the minute details of this teaching and read and read and read all the books and papers that have been written. So hopefully we're able to give a general enough of an understanding each of what spiral dynamics is and each of its stages, so that we can start applying it in a practical, everyday way in our lives and integrating these stages into our lives from wherever we're at. And I'm no expert at all. So I just want to say that. But really briefly, it's a model that was further developed out of the teachings of and the research of a gentleman by the name of Dr. Clare Graves. And he died in 1986. He started this work in 1951. I'm sort of piecing together many things that I have heard and read about the history of this teaching. So it's not coming from any one source. So this is a little kind of bunch of puzzle pieces that I'm trying to put together. And I'm sure I might butcher some parts of this because it's been a long time since I've kind of really heard that history. I did a session with Don Beck, a training, like a 3 or 4 day training in Boulder in 2003 or 4. So that's a really long time ago. Dr. Graves, well, when he was a graduate student, the Second World War was on, and most of the psychology department staff, the teachers, professors, were in the war. He didn't have to join the war because he had some kind of a physical ailment or disability or something like that that prevented him from going to the war. So when this university, because it didn't have all of its professors and they were mostly in the war, what they did for the psychology students was that they brought in different theorists, and each would present their findings, their research, and their claim as to who was a healthy individual or a healthy psychological being. So when he became a graduate professor himself, he taught a class on psychological surveying. So he would teach all these different various theories that different researchers have presented on psychology. And at that point, his students questioned him. So you're teaching us all these different theories. Which one is more accurate? Which one is the right theory about who a mature psychological human being is or was? And that question really puzzled him. What he did was he decided that he's going to start experimenting and researching, okay, what is actually the most accurate statement we could make on who a psychologically mature adult was. So he used his students, which were apparently, young adults who were just joining university, but also people were returning from the war. There were male, female, all age groups in his classes. So he invited them to write an essay about who they thought was a mature psychological human being, an adult. And he specifically had them not read anything or study anything. So it was just sort of free form. You decide who you think is a mature psychological being. And so the students wrote these essays, and then they created peer groups and created an opportunity for students to peer review each other. And he invited them to either revise your essay, your statement, or you could keep it as it was originally. So students got to do this. They peer reviewed each other, and then some students decided to revise their statement on who they thought a mature psychological adult was. Then he gave a second step to it, I guess a third step to it, which is, so the first was you write the essay without studying anything. And then you write a second essay after the peer review process. And then the third essay was after you had actually studied the authorities that have already written on this. So the different theoreticians and researchers were introduced to the students at this point. So once they received some information from authority figures in the field, then they got to further revise a third version of this essay. And he just started gathering all of these essays, and then he started, he hired or he invited external readers to read all of these essays. And he invited them to put these essays into different piles of whatever they saw seemed similar in sentiment could go in this pile, and then the others could go in this pile. So basically categorizing the sentiments that were expressed in these essays by all of his different students. And he did this semester after semester, year after year. He was gathering a lot of data, which he actually wasn't really sure what this data was providing him. He didn't really know what he was looking for, which is kind of cool because whenever you look at surveys, it's already a little bit prejudged because of who's creating the survey. And he wasn't sort of coming from that place. He was actually coming from this open sense of sort of what are these different sentiments on who a psychologically developed adult was. Oh, and then another really interesting thing that why Clare Graves' work is really important is that when he was a professor, he also got to attend a conference where he saw Abraham Maslow present his model on the hierarchy of needs. And he was destroyed by the other professors in that conference because Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs was a model based on his observations. It was a theory based on his observations, good observations, but there was no data behind it. And Clare Graves, having witnessed that, decided that he was never going to fall into that big messy place. So he really concentrated on gathering data. He really wanted to do his research using real subject matter. And after, sorry, this is like getting long, but afterwards, what he found after many, many years of sort of continuing to do this work was that he began to see a pattern in these different sentiments that were expressed in these essays, that there was a pattern of what people thought were, what his students thought were a mature psychological human being. There was a sense of a sacrificed self and an expressed self, and it was alternating. So they would sacrifice themselves for being rewarded later, but it was still about sacrificing self. And then he also saw a pattern of expressed self, where he saw that students were writing patterns or sentiments around, I will express myself, or a mature psychological adult would express themselves regardless of what others had to say. But then he also saw other sentiments of expressing self while still being able to hold space for other perspectives. So he started noticing these different patterns. And I think as you and I, Lee, we continue to introduce these different stages, we'll begin to see some of these sentiments of sacrifice self, express self, and various other patterns showing up throughout these different categories that he didn't have names for at that time. And certainly he didn't have colors. So we're going to be talking about colors for each of these stages, which came much later. Eventually, another sort of a finding that he discovered, that he sort of spoke about, was that these patterns indicated two realities. One was life conditions, that depending on external life conditions, it changed how we responded to the world. The other was what our psychological inner capacity was, also governed how we responded to the world or responded to ourselves. So these two things impacted and influenced each other, the external conditions and inner conditions. So that formed in his mind this image of a double helix. And the sense of the double helix was the two strands of the double helix was external life conditions and inner psychological capacity. And if you imagine them sort of spiraling, whenever there was a twist in the double helix, that in his mind was when someone shifted a stage or they became very different somehow in their value system. So ultimately, I think he probably identified that these findings were value systems. Eventually, he had a heart attack and he couldn't really read and write further. I don't know when he had a heart attack, but his students, other people, colleagues took his work forward. And some of the key figures that played a role were Don Beck, who still teaches to this day, also Chris Cowan and Natasha, I don't remember her last name. It's a hard last name to say. Natasha Todorbeck or something like that. Perhaps, I apologize. We'll correct it we'll put a note on the video. So they developed the work and they made it more accessible for people like you and I to start studying further, and they gave colors to each of the stages, which makes it easier to communicate. But I want to say already that the colors don't really mean anything. So that's a little bit of the history of how this whole thing kind of got started. And of course, maybe there's also something to be said around how we come from the Ken Wilber integral world a little bit, and Ken Wilber changed some of the colors. So although I may not have full details of how this came into being, for those of us who are coming from the integral philosophy world, we may have been introduced to these ideas that originated in spiral dynamics, but with a different set of colors. And I don't really know the politics of how all of this came into being, but Don Beck and Ken Wilber had some disagreements. And I'm not going to speak to the validity about in any of that. Don't even quite understand all of it, but I think Don Beck, Chris Cowan, a lot of them spoke about spiral dynamics as V memes for value memes. So they're really systems of values, how what we value that is seen as a center of gravity within each stage. Not sure if I'm saying it very well. But yeah, so it's a system. Spiral dynamics is a system where we can see what different stages have available to them as values. And what Ken Wilber presented with some slightly different colors that are a little bit more based off of the spectrum of light. Also, perhaps the colors of the chakras, somewhat similar and following the colors of the chakras. What he said was that each of these stages are mostly for him based on our general level of consciousness and what that level of consciousness has available to it is what separates each of these stages. So it's not, for Ken, it's not based off of just the values. For him, it's around our general level of consciousness. I honestly feel most of us got to learn about this model through spiral dynamics, so we were already used to that. And then Ken introduced this idea of consciousness within the stages. To me, it sort of kind of muddied up my understanding a little bit. And I'm also not afraid to say that it's okay. I can go with each of the sets of different colors, but I will make a personal claim, or I'll share a personal opinion, that even though Ken Wilber changed these colors for these different codes, when Ken himself or many others in the integral community talk about these stages, in my ears, what I hear is they're still speaking about the values, which is what spiral dynamics offered. So sometimes my preference is to go with the spiral dynamics system because I don't see a huge difference. Even though the colors were changed, what we speak about as the center of gravity for each of these stages sounds, looks the same to me. So either way, we have this beautiful system, this sequential developmental model that goes into giving us a view of how we evolve, what we value individually, but collectively, and the system itself. There are different patterns. For example, like I said, Clare Graves himself saw that there was this alternating pattern of express self and sacrifice self. When Don Beck and Chris Cowan gave colors, they gave warm colors to the express self patterns and then cool colors to the sacrifice self. I guess another pattern is that, as Ken Wilber and others have said, each of these stages transcend and include as we move up the stages. what else do you see as patterns that sort of apply to the whole model?
That's a great question indeed. So I would say that as you were discussing, moving from the cool colors to the warm colors and then back and forth again, that we could say that that's also a pendulum moving between the poles of masculinity and femininity, or agency and communion, and therefore also between individuality and community. So it appears to be the case that if we view reality as an expression of polarities, so of opposites that exist in relation to one another, then we can say that if we consider the spiral dynamics to be like time, then we move from day to night and then back from night to day, etc. And perhaps for people who are not yet familiar with this theoretical model, it can be useful to see that, as you said at the beginning, that it's not the case that the higher levels of the spiral are better necessarily than the lower levels, but they can be more appropriate under certain circumstances. But occasionally lower levels of development can also be more appropriate in other situations. So it's the case that the more access we have to various levels of the spiral, so the more value memes or values that we can base our actions on, the more flexible we can be and the more appropriate we can act within particular contexts. So that would be my my perception. What do you think of
Yeah,
that?
yeah, that's great. Also, kind of continuing along that theme of what you just said, and also the transcend and include idea, when we transcend a stage, according to this teaching, it does not mean that we get rid of the stage that we just left behind. We include it, but sometimes we may be even have we may have even evolved to a very high level of development up the spiral, but given life conditions, which I spoke about earlier, which was important to Clare Graves, we can fall, we can regress back to earlier stages, and sometimes it's necessary, which is what you were talking about as it being appropriate. Certain times, earlier stages are perhaps appropriate. I need to be able to survive at a very basic level if there was a bomb that exploded in my neighborhood right now. Or I live in America, it's a place of mass shootings. And if there was a shooting, like there was one in Boulder very recently, if I was in that supermarket where 10 people were gunned down, I would have fallen right back down to the earliest stage of beige, which we will talk about immediately. So there's those kinds of ways in which we need to include the previous stages. They don't disappear just because we evolve. However, if we're not paying attention, they can show up as repressed, disowned aspects of our lives, which we have talked about in other videos, and many people know as the concept of shadow driven by trauma. If there is trauma in the previous stages, the earlier stages, they will certainly show up in different ways, even if we are in a higher evolved stage. So it's not that we lose access to our higher level of development, even if we fall to an earlier stage. It's that we can really spiral up and down this. It's a very fluid model. They're not, as Ken Wilber says, they're not rungs in a ladder. They're much more that double helix spirally fluid movement. I guess the center of gravity is an interesting concept as well in this teaching. We have a center of gravity within some stage. While that might be the more prominent, more conspicuous value system or level of consciousness that we might be off, where according to Susan Greuter, for example, we have about 30% of the previous stage alive in us very well, as well as about 30% of the next emergent self that we're not yet aware of, that we can only sort of anticipate, but not until we get to what is called second tier. So I suppose that's another interesting concept in this model called first tier, second tier, third tier. Maybe perhaps you can speak briefly to that, Lee.
Yeah, so I like the way you described the transcend and include process, and I was thinking that it could be analogous to learning languages. So, for instance, say in your case, you were born in Sri Lanka, and what was your first language? Was that
Sinhalese.
Sinhalese? And then you've learned English, but you haven't lost Sinhalese, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So that's transcend and include also. So you've gained access to another language, but you haven't lost the first language. And depending on the circumstances, you can access either language whenever it's appropriate. So that's a way we can think about transcend and include, is adding extra languages, and these languages then represent value systems or value memes that that we can communicate in also. And I would also say that the language metaphor can work because languages also bind us to other people, and it's the same is true for the value system. So if you have similar tastes in music, for instance, that can be a very binding factor. And if the music has a particular type of energy or themes around it, which are related to values, then you can understand how these value memes can also be something that have us resonate as human beings with each other. And in relation to the tier system within spiral dynamics, there are basically 3 tiers, and the first tier system is the first 6 levels of development. And one of the characteristics of each of those 6 levels is that they tend to be exclusionary. They tend to perceive reality from a perspective that says only my value meme or value structure is valid and correct, and all of the other value memes are incorrect or inadequate. And that tends to be the perspective of each of these 6 earliest levels of development. And then from the 6th to the 7th level of development, something interesting happens, and that's that the people whose center of gravity lies in the 7th level of development, they tend to be able to see the value and the validity of each of the previous 6 stages of development or levels of development. That means that there's no longer a sense of opposition to the earlier stages. So that's why the first 6 stages are seen as the first tier, and the 2 stages above that, the 7th and the 8th, are seen as the second tier, where people are able to include and transcend and include all of the previous stages. And then from the 9th level of development upward, the sense is that there's a 3rd tier where the self is transcended further, which is one of the themes of the levels of development, that there's an increasing transcendence of self.
We know very little about 3rd tier. I always find it a little silly to even talk about 3rd tier because I have no idea. There's very little research. There's very few people or systems that are in that. However, according to the theory, this is unending. This is the double helix that will just continue to evolve way beyond our time on this planet. So it's a beautiful model that helps us really, I think, have a lot of hope for the future, theoretically speaking, at least. There's a couple of other things. That first tier, when there is a tier change, so first tier to second tier, as you said, first tier is some of the things we often see in the first tier stages are fear-based and lack-based. And what the different teachers have talked about, this quantum leap that is taken between the shift from first tier to second tier. The second tier patterns become much more holistic, much more abundance-based and being-based friendliness and friendliness to the whole spiral. And as you said, there is this beautiful capacity to not only not have a problem with other stages previous to them, but also really be able to celebrate the previous stages. You can actually celebrate the other stages. So that becomes a part of our spiritual work, even I would say, at that time. Apparently, individuals can't skip stages. So you don't just go from the archaic stage to the pluralist stage. From you don't skip stages. Clare Graves actually saw that in the essays when the students were revising some of these essays. There was a sequence to how they always, if they were in A, they would then go to B pile. If they were in B pile, they would go to the C pile. They wouldn't go to the F pile. So he saw these patterns, and that led him to believe and claim that this developmental process was sequential, stage by stage by stage for individuals. However, I don't know if Clare Graves spoke about it, but others like Ken Wilber have spoken about concepts such as individual hold-ons and social hold-ons, which we don't need to get into in this moment, but that societies, cultures can shift stages outside of that predictable stage that individuals have to go through. Based on technology, for example, can really shift a society into a different stage. So that's a different kind of a condition that has a different impact on a collective system outside of the individual system. So just that I would add.
Well, excellent, Amali. So that's the introduction to spiral dynamics, and we'll continue to create some videos on how to incorporate and integrate these stages, each of them, into our daily lives in next videos. So thanks everyone for watching.